So to be honest, we're in a little bit dangerous waters because I really, really badly want to make a joke about the fact that it's not Halloween, but I'm dressed in Christmas and I really want Christmas, even though I really don't want Christmas. Mostly I just really want to induce my roommate to put a Christmas tree in because it just makes me happy. And lights and the time change, and it's already so dark, and Christmas trees from November until March or April. You know, when the snow starts melting, then it's okay to take down the tree, okay? None of the 2 weeks things. And the problem with this joke is currently it's only 2 days before Halloween, and I know for sure that this video is not going to be posted before that, and most likely will go into like a random dish that one day when I don't have a video will be posted, and maybe at that point it will be Christmas time. So this whole kind of joke thing doesn't really set up, but I still want to share with you guys my, great sense of humor. So here we go. So after that needlessly long introduction, here is the Book Palette Tag, and a new tag that was originated by Fraser Simons, who is from Spinboard Thought, and he is a friend of the channel. He is a commenter and wonderful person who is often there, and he makes wonderful videos, so go check him out. But this is a great tag, and I'm very much looking forward to doing it. I really enjoyed his answers and the way that it really had a lot of questions and made you think about the way that you interact with books. So I just became a person who sat on my couch and thought about how I was going to answer these questions much more than I will answer these questions. Okay, let's jump into this without any more further delay. And for this we have Sweet, and this is a book that makes you want to read more by this author. And for me, this is going to be Jonathan Sims. I really, really, really like the mechanisms, and this is a collaboration musical band kind of thing by him and 7 other people or so. They pretend to be these kind of pirates that are like steampunk, but then they retell fairy tales, they retell the Odyssey, and Ulysses Dies at Dawn, which is just such a great title. They do like kind of a Western mixed with Arthurian legend, mixed with space stuff, and it's just so meta. It has great music, it has just like wonderful narration and like narrator going into it, and this made me really pick up like my first kind of podcast. Until this year I was never hugely into podcasts. There was a few YouTubers, specifically like Dear Hank and John and like Books Unbound and stuff like that I listened to occasionally, but I never really listened to podcasts, especially podcasts that had like narrative point of view. So this was really cool to go into this. And this is Magnus Archives, which is horror, which again, not a genre that I listen to. And it is so good. I really, really enjoy it. And it's definitely one of the books that is going to top my year of 2021. And even though it's not technically books, he wrote every single episode, wrote every line of every episode. The way that the show is set up is that we follow the archivist named Jonathan as well. And, he didn't really plan on having the character evolve, which he did, and he named it after himself, which, was kind of ironic and funny and all of those things. But the rest of them all have, like, names and then names of, like, other characters of, like, authors of horror and stuff like that, which was also super cool. And pretty much he just narrates these stories of horror. And it seems like an anthology, and then they start coming together, and we start getting a lot more of the things that are not just... And he works at this institution that looks at paranormal and kind of horror elements and stuff like that are supernatural, and they're supposed to read through all of this and kind of debunk them slash or see if any of them need follow-up or if we know anything. And I really, really enjoy it, and it's just such a great series, and it evolves into so many great things, and all of them are just spooky and so well done, and the character development in each episode is so good. This prompt on here is Sour, and it is a book that you initially disliked and then changed your feelings on it. And this one I vehemently just despised. And this is Sula by Toni Morrison, and I just really, really didn't like it. And it's very interesting for me to see the development of when I went and reread it 3.5 years later maybe, and how much I had changed. I really haven't read anything much from the 70s because a lot of these questions have things like, how did this impact the genre, and like how your kind of things are related around the themes. And as much as I like to say that I've read classics for a very, very long time, I definitely did not read that many classics growing up. I researched them and I looked at them, and I definitely didn't read a lot of classics that were by Black authors or books that were set in the 1970s that were, explicit in content. I think I was 20 when I read this. I was deeply uncomfortable, and I was really annoyed by the character, and I just felt really, really frustrated at the whole story, and I thought that the way that she was acting was just terrible. And then going back 3.5 years later and like reading it and realizing that I missed so much of the nuance, that I missed so much of the language. I think that part of it was that I was triggered by it, and that I was really not okay, and that I really, really struggled with the content that was presented the first time, and it was very hard to read. And I think that over the last few years I've definitely become much more accustomed to scenes and stuff like that are very difficult. And I've also dealt with my own trauma in my own life, which definitely helps. I don't really know if I have a huge thing about Sula. I think that it shows how much I've changed as a person that I read it and just really just disliked it. And I think a lot of people dislike Sula, so I'm not alone in that. But I really couldn't get past how terrible the main character was and how despicable she was. And rereading it later actually made me more appreciate her and almost like not quite look up to her, but definitely sympathize with her a lot more. And I think that that might also kind of show my progression from a kid to more of an adult in that, because I wasn't a kid when I was 20, but more simple thoughts about how things should be done in the universe. And I think that as we get older, we learn more of the complexities. So the next prompt is bitter, and it is, what is a book that you felt is underrated, misunderstood, or you feel like is attacked? And for this one, I kind of want to go with Dracula. Like, my obvious choice is Frankenstein because I want to make a cult around that. Like, I'm still waiting for my Frankensteinian cult that really just helps people not misunderstand the context, because you know it is a really deep conversation about who plays God and all of these things. I just really, really, really love the story. But also Dracula. I've read it and I really enjoyed it. And my roommate just read it and I was like listening to her read it because she was listening to an audio, and I was like, I just don't get the accusations of sexism around it. And I really think that Mina is such a strong character, and I really like Lucy. Yeah, like she turns into a vampire, but and she does vampire things. But to me, that isn't really about the fear of sexuality and the fear of all of these things. Like, I think that especially Mina is such a strong, independent story. And throughout it, it really points out the fact that, like, no, you should have been listening to her. No, you really should listen to her. And all of these things. And I don't know, whenever people are like, Dracula is all about sex and it's all about, like, women being submissive and all of these things, and I'm like, I just don't read it. I don't think that Bram Stoker was like a proto-feminist, but I also don't think that his characters are one-dimensional. It definitely makes me slightly frustrated that a book that I think is actually a really good, solid female character gets like attacked all the time because a woman turns into a vampire. It's a vampire book. And like, yes, only the women turn into vampires or almost turn into vampires. So like maybe that's a conversation, but I just don't think that Mina and Lucy are characters that are one-dimensional or are only there to be, you know, foils for sexuality and not sexuality or things like that. I just think that they're really good characters and their friendship is so good. Like, they have a stronger, more beautiful, more dynamic and strong relationship than like half the fiction I read today. I just read a bunch of books that are nominated for the Booker Prize and is set in 2021, and almost all of them don't have as good female characters as Dracula. That was, you know, 130 years ago. So to me, it's really frustrating that people are like, yes, it's super sexist. And I'm like, yeah, like there's elements of sexism in it, definitely. But I would not say that is primarily a sexist work. And obviously, that is, people can have differing opinions and stuff like that. Everything in the 1890s was a little bit sexist. Okay, I'm not dismissing sexism, but I think that primarily it's not sexist. The next prompt is salty. What is a book that made you change your thoughts about the world or about yourself and all of these things? And there's a book that I wanted to talk about because it really changed my thoughts about what I thought about myself and really opened up a lot of questions about things. And the more that I thought about it, the more I felt like I was like, I'm not really ready to discuss this online. And I think that that's a really valid thing that we don't talk about enough. Like, I definitely believe in vulnerability and how vulnerability can really foster empathy and community and like really break down isolation and all of those things. But that's a part of my that I'm not really sure about and I'm not really ready to talk about. And I think that it's important sometimes to talk about those elements, because I've heard, you know, people talk about the fact that they don't necessarily always feel comfortable reading a book because it might bring up conversations that they're not ready to talk about. And I think normalizing not always having to read yourself into text and not always wanting to be a peg about how something relates to you is something that is perfectly okay on BookTube and, you know, in the rest of life. People are sometimes too nosy for their own good, because any other book that I brought up would feel like I wasn't actually being true to the book that I was thinking about. And like books, to be honest, there's many books. Anyways, we need to go on. We really don't need to be that cryptic. It's not like that big of a deal or like that major of a deal. It's just intrapersonal musings in my head. And then for the connoisseur time, we have these different kinds of palettes. And the first one is a sophisticated palette, and you know, like a sophisticated person, I completely forgot to talk about this. And I like literally just scrolled through on Goodreads. I've read a lot and I enjoy a lot, and I think that it's very frustrating for me to sometimes have to peg that in. And obviously that's not what he's trying to do with the tag and stuff like that. It's just like my own things. I was just like, which is a book that I've not like yelled at the world about enough? I wasn't going to answer this question because I had too many thoughts, and I just like looked around me and I found this precious book. The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein is just one of my favorite books. I think it is so well done, and I really, really like retellings. I don't always like retellings, but this is a book that I don't talk about enough. It doesn't get a lot of buzz, but I just think that it's just so wonderful. And look at this beautiful, beautiful cover, and it's such a great feminist story. And if we're talking about characters that actually allowed me to feel heard, this is a book that made the protagonist relate to me in ways that I've never fully had another protagonist relate to, because I think the big thing for me in following Elizabeth in that book is that she's a person that is primarily run by logic, and that she's primarily allowed to be a strong female character without necessarily taking on male characteristics. That, you know, she's really good at making people feel like that she is docile, or making people feel like she's submissive in order to she can get ahead, and that doesn't take away her femininity, that doesn't take away her strong femininity or her valid as a person. And I just really, really adore the story. So that is a book from a subgenre of retellings and of like historical fiction and of Kirsten White in general that I just really, really love. The next one is Guilty Pleasures, and I really, really just like beat around the bush trying to figure out this because, like, you know, I don't want to say romance. I don't read a ton of romance, and I do enjoy romance sometimes, but like, you know, us trashing on romance books is just so overdone and like sexist and misogynistic, and I hated it so much. Like, women are allowed to enjoy stories that are about romance, and you don't have to yell about them. But the one that I would say that is probably the most guilty pleasure that a lot of people wouldn't even consider reading is the fact that I love comics. I haven't read as many comics lately than I love, because I don't know, I go in waves of like what it was. Like, I feel like the spring, all I did, like, you know, 80% of my reading each month was comics, and the time is like 1 or 2 per month. I am really, really love comics. And the fact that I read a lot of superhero comics, and I love Batman, and I love all these stories, a lot of people would judge that. And I think that is completely valid reading, and I get a lot out of the comics. So I am hoping that as the winter turns cold, I will feel more like reading comics again. And the next one is an eclectic palette, and this one is definitely true for me. I think that I read pretty much across the board, and I really, really enjoy. I don't think that there's a genre that I can really think of that I have not enjoyed from. Probably like some obscure genre or something like that, but like overall there's at least one part of each major genre that I can think of. One of the things that I think is very true about myself is that I will read really intensely about something, and then I won't pick it up before like a couple months or a couple years or something like that. Off the top of my head, the things that came to me that I continue to gravitate toward always is classics, poetry, and nonfiction. Maybe autofiction. I really like autofiction. I've been into it a lot lately. So the last one is maturing palette, and I was really like hesitant around mentioning this one because this is a genre that you have grown into, or that you're interested in getting into, and kind of which books got into. And there's a lot of pretentiousness around literary fiction and stuff like that that I just don't think is valid. Like, whether you call it genre fiction or whatever and all of that, like, I don't think that that's valid. And I think that, you know, looking down on fiction because it's not winning national prize awards is idiotic, and I hate it. I have been reading a lot of literary fiction. This summer I read Claire in the Sun by Kazuo Ishiro, and I really, really liked it. And it also made me want to go back to science fiction, which I've definitely been neglecting of late. So that also had a thing, and like maybe I would read AI fiction, which I've like never ever really been interested in before, which was interesting to find out that. Kazuo Ishiro specifically made me want to go and read a bunch of the Booker Prize and a lot of the Giller Prize and stuff like that, and really just like search out more of these books that win prizes, because I find it really interesting, and I love like betting and like looking at like short lists and stuff like that. I've always been incredibly competitive and like wanting to do this, so I think that that is a big element, because I'm not having a fun time with reading the Booker Prize. Like, the books that I really love did not make the shortlist, and the shortlist is currently destroying me. I'm not enjoying it at all. So, you know, it's like more like this is fun competition rather than I'm enjoying these books. But I am enjoying aspects of them, and I do enjoy literary fiction. I just don't think that I necessarily enjoy literary fiction that always wins awards. Again, what's with all the dudes just writing about not women? So with all that to say, I want to tag a few people. I'm not very good at tagging people at the end of videos because it always seems weird and, you know, all of that things. But I do want to tag a person who came over from Instagram. I followed her for a very long time. Her name is Sarah. She is at the Magical Reader, and I think that she's really lovely. So go show her some love, or like do this tag, and it'll be super fun. And then also my friend Eva, she is wonderful and I adore her so much. And she came back from BookTube after like 2 years of kind of hit and miss and all of those things. She was over in Canada for a while, and we got to meet, and it was super great. She's from Germany originally, so I'm always really excited to see her. But anyone who wants to do this tag, of course, is tagged. But tell me how your reading tastes and things like that have changed, or a book that you got to know yourself about more because of a book. That's always interesting. Happy reading, writing, and I'll talk to you next time.